Hello there, folks. This is your boy Chuck, and I tell you, welcome to episode 23. That was silly. I don't know why I did that. Anyways, yeah, it's just your boy Chuck for now, but your boy Omar will be in the episode. And hey, like I said, this is episode 23, and it's a good one, man. Oh, we got so much to say. I had a story for you, but oh my gosh, Matt Miller, he has so many amazing things to say. I'm not even going to steal any of his thunder. After the episode, my brain hurt. Me and Omar were talking for hours, and we're like, what do we even know, bro? What do we even know about the Bible? What book have I been reading for the past 18 years? It's not the same one Matt Miller is. It's not the same one. Hey, you'll see what I mean. Hey, let me ask you a question. What if I told you Book of Mark, yes, the Gospel, is the same or is set up like the movie Inception by Christopher Nolan? What? What you talking about, Willis? Yeah, well, check it out. I'm not going to say no more. Stick around. Listen to the episode. It's going to blow your mind. Hopefully, you guys really enjoy it. And if you haven't yet, please go check out Matt Miller at logosmadeflesh on YouTube. Amazing videos. But hey, without further ado, let's get to this show. Stick around, folks. Welcome back, folks. Fire Theft Radio in the house.
What is this, 1991?
Hey, man, I'm taking you back right now, you know? Hey, I was listening to some Deep House earlier. That's probably why, you know?
Dude, who even says in the house now?
Hey, don't
like,
make me...
Like, my face is red right now, dude.
I'm physically embarrassed now because
I'm
you're
embarrassed
putting me
for
on
you
blast.
right now, dude.
Okay, let's get to it. Hey, Volume 3. Hey,
right
step back. Let me do this intro real quick, okay? Volume 3. So he's still laughing in the background. Volume 3 of Signs and Symbols. And we have Matt Miller back from Logos Made Flesh. He needs no introduction because you've hopefully seen his videos, which are amazing. I binged them all. Like it was great. It was a great experience. We have him back. But also, Omar, you have something to say or introduce yourself or anything? What's going on?
Yeah, well, I can introduce myself, I guess. What's up, everybody? My name's Omar. But yeah, let me continue. Something that you maybe did not know about Matt Miller is that he won a male beauty pageant, Mr. Camas, his freshman year of high school.
Wow.
Can you believe that? We're talking to a beauty pageant winner.
I did not know that. Oh my gosh, you were doing your research, Omar. Look
at
you,
been.
Investigative reporter.
I always do my research, man. I want no crazy nut coming
on our show.
Podcast. We're the only crazy nuts, dude.
Oh gosh. Anyways, welcome back to the show.
Even read my 25 things about me.
I read them last time and I completely forgot to mention them. I completely forgot to mention that. But we can't continue this podcast without you explaining that. What's up with that?
Well, yeah, what's going on?
Because I saw your picture and I don't know. It doesn't seem like you should win a beauty pageant. What happened to you?
I think it was
kidding,
more. It was kind of a voted in thing. I got voted in to do a male beauty pageant, which was a fundraiser. I can't remember, for choir or something like that. So freshman, senior, sophomore, junior, they all were participated. There was 3 guys in each grade, and I got selected for the freshman class, and I ended up winning. I think I got selected primarily because I was a Christian and I was a nice guy and I helped a lot of people out. So it wasn't anything about me, but had a lot of fun with it. And I think the 2 guys that ended up doing the talent competition, they didn't really take it seriously. I ended up singing a song, "Blessed Are the Tears" by Brian Duncan, and so it was a talent show, and I did all right.
Sing, huh?
What was that?
So you can sing, huh?
Back in the day, a little bit
Back
better
in
than
the
I can
day.
today. I don't claim I don't claim anything today.
See,
So
that's the type of beauty
I
pageant that Chuck would win, is a Christian one, because they look at his inside, not his outside.
I don't know if you've heard any of the other episodes, Matt, but he's always talking about how ugly I am. It's really messed up. I don't understand where that comes
Wow.
from.
It's
you
just
know?
jealousy,
harsh,
dude.
man.
It's
It's
jealousy,
jealousy.
bro. You're such a good-looking man. I can't help it.
All
I
right,
envy
man. That's
you.
enough. That's enough shenanigans. Let's get on with the show.
Yeah.
Got a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, we do. Okay, so we do definitely have a lot to do, a lot of serious stuff to talk about, but you know how we do it here, man. We're just ourselves. We're keeping it real. But hey, Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show with us again. Thank you for honoring us with your presence here. So thank you so much.
Oh man, thank you.
Yeah, we want to continue this conversation, like my buddy Chuck over here has said, about signs and symbolisms. And we were messaging off air a while ago, and blowing my mind, man. You were telling me about the book of Mark, and you were telling me all these things and how it's relatable to movies. And so maybe before we get into that, we can talk a little bit about we were talking about off air is because you told us a little bit about it in the last show, but maybe we can continue it and expound on it. What's your purpose with your Logos Made Flesh YouTube channel?
Well, I started I started making videos about 2 years ago now, and the purpose was I had an idea, was basically just walk people through the Bible. So I started with the Gospel of Mark, and I was doing 5-minute increments, just kind of like the Bible Project. I don't know if you guys are aware of Bible Project.
Yes.
Tim Mackey.
Yeah, it's really
very
good.
great. Yeah, very fantastic stuff. The problem with teaching the Bible visually on YouTube, on YouTube, is that it's not a visual thing. So to help people understand, you've got to make it visual. You've got to help people see it, show the pattern, show the structure, that kind of stuff. And the Bible Project does a really good job of doing that. Well, I had an idea of doing the exact same thing. I like what they do, but they tend to take, they were doing the whole book of a Bible in 5 minutes. And I thought, well, there's a lot to a book. You probably could break it down into even smaller sections and continue on with that. So that's what I wanted to do. So I got about 5 or 6, maybe 6 episodes into it, and I got to the part where I basically made the claim that Mark is like a movie, and that I felt was a bit of a jump for a lot of people. So showing people symbolism, showing people the way that Mark is structured, is basically like movies are today. If you would look around at any type of genre today, any type of, like, if you went to look at or read a book, like for instance history, if we went to read a history book, it doesn't look anything like the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, all that kind of stuff. So when people say that Mark is history, John is history, it doesn't look like what we understand history today. Or if you look, so what type of I'm trying to get my head around this again, but what type of genre is Mark, John, the books of the Bible comparable to? And it's not much different from going to watch a movie. And here's why I say that. In the first century, most people couldn't read. About 90% of the people couldn't read. Only 10% of the population was literate. So when you read anything, or when you were introduced to any type of literature, it was always read out loud. The original Greek manuscripts that we have, that Paul wrote and Mark wrote and John wrote, they don't have any punctuation. They don't have any capitalization. They don't have any paragraph indentations. They don't even have spacing between words. So it's one giant scroll, the letters just all jumbled together in terms of the reading, in terms of the written page, because when people weren't meant to look at the page. People were meant to hear it read out loud to them. So what was the experience like? Well, going to church, these books were read out loud in a single sitting. Somebody who was trained in the art, someone who had practiced, someone who had received the message perhaps themselves, heard the author read it to them, delivered that message to the people, standing up, reading it out loud in the entire in the service. So that was the message. There was no expounding of the Bible bit by bit by bit.
More than just read, they were performed as well, right?
That's right. That's right. So the Gospel of Mark, you think of it, it's a darkened, let's just think of it as a darkened room. Someone at the front is standing up, reading this story out loud to you. And the experience is in about an hour and a half, about a 2-hour time block. That's how long it takes Mark to read Mark out loud, about an hour and 15 minutes. So it's about the same length of time as a movie. And that's not where it doesn't end there in terms of the correspondence between a movie and the Gospel of Mark or any other book of the Bible. So structurally, how do you put all that stuff together? How do you get people to understand something in a given amount? I tell a story in that amount of time. Well, the structure, the way we tell a story in that length of time has not changed. So when movies started coming into the fray, when they started making movies, they drew from plays. And plays drew from earlier stories, but it was all about the same amount of time, about 2 hours long, about 3 hours long, sometimes even 4 hours long. But there's a maximum length of time that you can sit someone down to tell them a pretty good story. I'm kind of trying to bring some thoughts together that I haven't really thought about for a couple of years now. So if you guys would bear with me.
It's making sense.
So,
definitely, it's making sense. I think that's why that kid you remember when Paul was reading that letter, he fell down because he fell asleep. Because Paul was probably like on his third hour reading through a scroll, and the kid's like, "Oh man, this is pretty good, but I gotta go to bed." And then he just fell asleep, and he's like, and he fell down. He's like, "Oh snaps, what happened? I didn't mean to put you to sleep, bro."
So when you sit down and you read, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, and I say it's like a movie, it's obviously not real life. And I say that because most Christians don't even get that in their mind. When you read the Gospel of Mark, it is not true in the sense that we experience life. Let's just say that. It is a construct. It is a purposeful, intentional, edited piece of literature. It has the appearance of reality, but itself is not real. You get that?
Yes, yes. You literally made my head fall backward right now. But yes, I get it. I haven't thought about it like that before.
So most people, when they approach the Bible, they open it up, they read it as if it's unedited, firsthand eyewitness accounts. So we read Mark, we read Matthew because they're supposedly eyewitnesses. And so when they sat down to write these stories, they had no forethought. It was just as if they saw it that day and they wrote it down, and it was firsthand account. And so it was as if they had a video camera and they walked around and just followed the life of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this is what happened. So what is said is what happened. And that's not really why it exists the way that it exists.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it'd be all exactly the same. They all have different perspectives, every single book, you know?
That's right. But it's even more than simply just looking at it from a slightly different angle. If I was standing over here and you were standing over here, it's edited in the same way that a movie is edited. So let's just look at a few history.
So it's purposely edited to make you feel a certain way. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
That's right. It's like, let's just say it's a sermon. It's a message. It is
okay.
It is more. So if you have a story, a person wants to tell you a story, they stand up and they tell you, a story, but there's always a point to the story. I either want to make you laugh, I want to make you cry, I want to get you to feel something, I want you to know something. I'm telling you a story, and the story has a purpose. It's not as if I'm just telling you the story because it's just what happened. Sometimes we do tell those stories because somebody wants to know what happened, but it's not just what happened, it's the meaning of what happened. And it's the way that it's edited together, the way that it's structured together, that tells us the meaning or the purpose of why that thing exists.
I'm seeing in my head, for example, for people that still might not get it a little bit, let's say you're watching a Michael Bay film. There's a lot of cuts, real fast, because they want to make you feel the action. Oh, a lot of stuff's going on right now here. Check this out, check that out. Boom, 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 boom. Stuff's going on, right? But then there's those scenes in, much more powerful scenes or in movies that are really like King's Speech. There's a lot of still scenes, and the camera's moving in slowly, dolly effect. And sometimes everything else is blurred, but the character, they really want you to focus on that person and what he's saying. Even the color of it, the way it's presented, all of it is representing something. And if you're talking about that, these people that were reading these things out loud, I would imagine that they understand the context or the feeling or the emotion behind of what they're reading, and so they're even performing it in that way so people can understand exactly what the scripture was trying to say. Am I
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Absolutely, but let's just take it in terms of let's take what this is. These are historical documents in that sense. They're telling a story that is actually true. They're telling a true story, and we find movies doing that all the time. They tell true stories, but what do we find at the very beginning? This is based on a true story, and we know because like, for instance, let's look at just perhaps a recent movie, Lincoln. I think 2007, Steven Spielberg, Daniel Day-Lewis presented himself as Lincoln, and it was about the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is a historical movie, but right away we know, in being a historical movie, this is not history itself, because Daniel Day-Lewis is literally not Abraham Lincoln, and we know that the character and the dialogue more or less are generally following the historical events, but they're not the same as the historical event themselves. We know that instantly because we know it's a movie. It's a movie, not the event itself. But if you watch Lincoln, here's one of the things that I pull out when most people don't realize is Lincoln came out in 2007, and they're talking about Emancipation Proclamation, about freedom for the slaves, and yet it has a lot to do with marriage. Did you guys ever see that? Did you guys see the movie?
Yeah, we saw it.
Remember at the very last scene of the movie, Tommy Lee Jones, senator, comes and sits and gets in bed with his wife.
Yeah, that was scandalous for the time.
And it's his wife, and his wife is a black lady, perhaps a former slave, perhaps one of his, supposedly slaves. So the movie has everything to do with gay marriage. And yeah, so that issue of Emancipation Proclamation is about freedom for the slaves. What does it have to do with marriage? Not much. But Steven Spielberg, in that time and place, wanted you to see the parallels between that event and what was going on in 2007, and that's why he made that movie then. So the issue is it a true story? Yes, it's a true story. But the themes that are brought up and the ideas and images that are shown are for a present situation, for a people that's for us right now. So for instance, here's another example. I mean, we can look at different plays have done this. The Crucible by Arthur Miller, a play written in the 50s, is about the Salem witch trial. And in the 1950s, what was going on at the time was the McCarthyism, blacklisting of Hollywood writers. So his play is a veiled reference to what's going on in the present. He's telling you a story that's historical, but that history is about right now. And that's what we do with stories. We tell stories not so much about the past, but about the present, and we use the story to explain our present circumstance, or to give some insight or meaning into what's going on.
Right.
So there's a reason why we're telling the story this way. And so that's so when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we say, or John or Luke, is that they weren't just telling us about what happened. They're telling us what happens. They're telling us what is going on right now, the situation that we're in. Why is this story important to us right now?
So at the time, it was culturally relevant.
culturally relevant. The story is for us. So if you start with the book of Mark, for instance, Mark starts out, he doesn't give you an explanation about John the Baptist. He assumes that you already know John the Baptist. So this story is obviously written for people who already know the story. And you can do that occasionally, like if you're like, for instance, Abraham Lincoln. If you do a movie about Lincoln, our culture knows who Lincoln is. You don't have to explain some of these things that are background information, the Civil War, all that kind of stuff. It can be assumed because the audience who's listening to this is probably inculcated into the context of this story. Anyway, that's what I just want to say is that when we start looking at a movie, we realize it's not the thing itself. It's something that's mediated for us, and there's a purposeful intention in terms of how it's edited. So that things. So when I tell people, like for instance in John chapter 4, and we talked about this last time about the water symbolism, and I say that the Samaritan woman left her water jar there. Remember that? She gets so excited. I don't know if you guys remember this. She gets so excited that she found the one. It says that she left her water pot there and ran back into the city. And I ask people, well, why did she leave her water pot behind? Well, for people who tend to see the Gospels as simply videotaped, unedited, first-person accounts, it's a trivial detail that means nothing other than that she was really excited and left her water pot because she was so excited she just lost her mind and just ran and left her water pot behind. But in John's gospel, it doesn't work like that, because we're not talking about we're not talking about a real world that can be explored, but a world that is defined by the structure of the book. And so when she leaves her water pot behind, it has a real meaning inside the structure, the layout, the edited version that says that she left her water pot. Well, the word water pot only occurs one other time in the Gospel of John. It's in John chapter 2, where Jesus used 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification. And then he turns that water into wine, into a living water. So when she leaves her water pot behind, it has everything to do with the fact that she's leaving tradition behind, leaving this idea behind, and going to embrace what Jesus is offering, which is living water. She's leaving behind the past to embrace a new future, with Jesus as the person who's offering this living water.
That's show's over. We're done here. This is you're just constantly blowing our minds. I can't even think right now. It's like,
Well, yeah. It makes. I think this stems from I'm speaking for myself right now, from my perception for the last 20 years of how I've read the Bible. I think that, like, this whole topic of an inerrancy, and that it's like, I used to think, okay, this is how I started reading the Bible. I started reading it thinking that it was a book that was, these people got this message zapped into their brain, and then all of a sudden they just started writing down,
like spirit writing.
Yeah, spirit writing, and just
dictation,
dictation, and that's how it was written. Each book, and that's how it was written. That's what I used to think, and then it morphed more into, maybe it wasn't like that. Now these are historical books, and these were, just different points of views. But now, as time goes on, my view of what the Bible is, it's more of a narrative. It's more of of course it's not a fictional book, but the narrative has a lot to do with what the author of that said book wants you to know, that everything that is written down, all these signs, all these symbols, all these archetypes, they have a purpose, they have a meaning. They want to tell you, the reader, the listener in ancient times, when you were listening and imagining in your mind the movie that was being played upon that stage, upon that altar to you, you would understand and you would see these. And so every time it was performed, you would get something new. It's like every time you watch a movie, you get something new. Why? Because these archetypes and these symbols point towards something. And right now, what specifically you just said about this pot and that woman leaving tradition and leaving things behind, if I was sitting back in the past, chilling, maybe like with my robe and listening to this guy, and he would have said, and she left the pot behind, I'm like, oh, she's leaving tradition behind. Whoa. I'd be like, Chuck, bro, dude, she's leaving tradition behind. And so it's something that I probably would have grasped, but because now I read it, and it's something superficial. We think that these little details don't matter, but they were penned with a purpose. Man, okay, my rant's over. Completely understand now, Matt.
Yeah, and I think that when I start telling people that something's like, for instance, John 19:34. I mean, when you go that the blood and water flowed, that Jesus pierced side and the blood and water flowed. Why did John put that in there? And the person who sees it simply as the unedited videotape says, well, that's just what happened. That's just what happened. And I find this with people who watch movies today too. It's as if, like, for instance, when I just did a video on The Sixth Sense, and I said, why is his name Cole Sear? And the guy's name's Malcolm. Well, that's just their names. And it's like, well, in the case of The Sixth Sense, not with the case of the Gospels, but in the case of The Sixth Sense, it is entirely a fabricated story. Everything has been thought up by an author for a purpose.
Right.
And it could be that it's just the whim of an author, like he just, flipped a coin and put his finger and just tried to find a name. Or it could be that it was intentional to his design. And that's more or less what we've got to look in terms of the Gospels. I'm not going to say every sentence, every word potentially has a more profound meaning than simply it just happened that way.
Yeah.
No, indeed. Man.
So it could have just happened that way, but it possibly also is the reason the author's putting in there is for his purpose.
Yeah, I think it makes sense if you see it within the greater narrative. If that particular item, object, symbol makes sense within the greater narrative, then it has a particular purpose that the author wanted you, the listener / reader, to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think it's a little bit for those people who feel a little bit, this could be, or maybe are not accepting what we're talking about. I mean, I think what crossed my mind when I first started hearing things like this is just for my own personal thing, so I don't know if anybody else felt this way, but my personal thing was like, okay, I started finding out, hey, this possibly wasn't dictated, this possibly wasn't like spirit written by these people. At first, you kind of get that feeling like, oh my gosh, it's taking the supernatural out of the Bible.
It's taking God
yeah, like
out
it's
of the
taking
Bible.
God out of the Bible, and it's kind of like it's I don't know demystifying.
Yeah,
is
it's
the
like
word,
taking the divinity
Right.
out of this
and
book.
There you go, taking the divinity out of the book is what I was looking for, and it's really not, because what you're saying right now is actually elevating the Word of God on another level, because it's giving you much more detail that you would have never seen before, because you're not taking it for face value and you're actually looking into the symbols. Like, it's, in all honesty, what it's done to me, it's really elevated it at another level, and I'm understanding it in a way that I've never understood it before,
Yeah. I think the question of inspiration and dictation versus plenary verbal inspiration, or one of the other theories of inspiration, is it's coupled, but it's not quite what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about the fact that whatever, basically the Bible's inspired. I believe that the Bible's inspired. The Bible tells us it's inspired. I believe that what we have is authoritative for the life of the believer. It is true with the intent that God gave it to us, and that's so it is our authority. It is binding upon us. The story is meant to transform and shape our lives into the trajectory of that story. But it's still, I would say, it could have been, God could have done that through dictation, even if it wasn't. The question is it accurate to the details or not, in the sense that we've always assumed. And I don't necessarily, God could have dictated it whatever way he wanted to. Whatever God wrote is inspired. And I think our understanding of this has to be factual in that way. I don't think is the rub. That's the rub for most people. It's like, no, it has to be true in the sense that I believe it's true. Well, no, it's true in the sense that God intended it for it to be true, because we know that there's parables, and in what sense did God intend for those to be true? We know that there's, I would even say reportages of false accounts in Scripture, and it's in the intent of which those are reported, which is true. Anyway, it's a huge it's a huge subject to get into, but
yeah, it's a deep rabbit hole to get down into. But you know what? It's those hard questions that when you're a believer, you have to ask. I mean, because you have to be honest with yourself. And you have to look at these things for what they are, because what's the sense in believing something that's not true? You know, then you're cheating yourself. But I think because God is the meta truth and his wisdom has immediate effect within our reality, it's just not good advice. What is in the Bible takes immediate effect and changes reality in the moment when you act upon said wisdom. So that being said, you read the Bible and you take these things, you take these truths, and you implement them, and they work. And that's why you dig deeper, and the deeper you dig, the more they work. The more you realize that this is true, that all truth, all truth stems from these words of wisdom that have transcended the last thousands of years. God only knows how far Genesis goes, how far Adam and Eve goes through oral history. But these truths have affected human beings, have affected Israel, us, for thousands of years. So how can it not be true? Because they affect reality in the moment. It's just like, this is what I tell people. It's just like, okay, the 10 Commandments, they're not just a good advice. It's just not a good way to live your life. No, they have substantial repercussions within reality that if you follow them, your life will change in the immediate. Why? Because all life is geared towards, it perpetuates, emanates from truth, which is which is God, which is us to live in this truth, you know? I don't know. I just went on this whole rant right now. I had a Red Bull, bro.
No. You had a Red Bull?
And the spirit is working in me, man. Overtime.
That's good. I think, but I mean, I don't want to, I think in what sense is it true is a big question, particularly with the Gospels and with a lot of the stories in the Bible and the Old Testament, is that in what sense is it true? And I think that if we said, for instance, nobody goes around saying, unless you want to be, there's a YouTube channel called History Buffs, and I like the channel. I think he's pretty good at what he does. But he rips apart a story to shreds, a movie to shreds, based upon the fact that it's not history. And I'm like, of course it's not history. It's a movie. I mean, we all know that. So why do you assume that it's not? So my point is that when we go to the Gospels and it says based on a true story or a true story, like at the very beginning of a movie, and we'd say sometimes in a movie, for instance, they conflate characters, because you can't give a person's life story in 2.5 hours and have it by any means understandable if you don't conflate characters. So you might say, well, that person didn't literally say that, but there was a person that was like that in his life. But instead of taking one character, now they've taken 3 characters and melded them in. Instead of taking 3 characters, they melded them into one character. So technically, that person didn't say that, but someone did say that. That was expressed by someone. And so storytellers do that in order to compress the data, to compress what's happening, so it's understandable for people. Because again, a 2.5-hour movie, like for instance the Gospels isn't true. Let's just say this in this sense. The Gospels is not true in the sense that it took me an hour and 15 minutes to read this. It did not take an hour and 15 minutes for Jesus to experience all these things. So right there, it's not true. It is mediated truth.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that sense is that. So, in what sense are we talking true? Well, we can mathematically break it down in every single way possible and find that it's not true, because there's lots of ways we can find it's not true. It's true in the sense that it was meant to be true. It's true in the sense that it was intended to be true, and that's really it's really key. So, for instance, when we have a movie like Lincoln, they say it's a true story. Well, it is a true story. in the sense that the story was meant to be true. But if we wanted to go, well, it doesn't really fit this or that or this circumstances, it's like, well, that's not the intent of the author. The author was trying to tell a story, and this was the purpose. And given those purposes, this is what he told us.
Yeah.
So that, I don't know if that helps at all.
No, it does.
Really
I think, and I think that's where most like atheist non-believers, that's their hiccup. Well, that's their excuse. Let's just say that, because that's what it is, an excuse. Like, oh, that book, there's so many things that are wrong with it. There's so many inconsistencies. See here, it says 20,000, and over here it says 10,000. The whole entire book is wrong. And you're like, bro, like if you now understanding these things that Matt Miller has presented to us, you're like, well, dude, this is how way it works. What do you what do you want?
Here's an example that that's funny, is that everybody remembers the Da Vinci Code and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into Da Vinci Code, but just the picture of the Last Supper that Leonardo da Vinci painted, right, and everybody's on the one side of the table, as if this snapshot's going to happen, right? And everybody, let's pose for the picture. And we know that it's not the Last Supper, and yet it is the Last Supper. I mean, it is a representation of what the historical event in the life of Jesus, and Leonardo da Vinci has chosen to capture that in a specific way. And why did he choose to specifically capture it that way? Well, the interesting thing is that in that it was painted on the wall of a refectory, which is a dining hall, a cafeteria, basically for a bunch of monks, right? And the way that the tables were arranged is they were all arranged to face that table, so that table became the head table. And if you look at the dimensions of the room is elongated in the picture of the Last Supper. So we don't see that because we hang it on our walls. But the original context of that painting was to show that this room is the room in which the Last Supper is occurring. As monks ate their meal, they were meditating and thinking about this painting. And everybody is on that side because now they're facing out to all these monks who are eating their meal. And it's the moment at which Jesus says to his disciples, one of you will betray me. And so everybody's asking, is it me, Lord? Is it me? And those monks in that moment who are eating their meals are meant to do the same thing. Is it me? Am I going to betray you? So the purpose of the painting is to, and the reason the painting is done the way that it is not to shit. He's not just simply going, I'm going to do a true to life historical picture of the Last Supper. No, he's inviting us into that moment, so that we can examine ourselves and ask, is it me? Or at least the monks who were in that room. Is it I, Lord, that's going to betray you? So that's what movies do. That's what stories do. Stories are not simply telling us history. And even history is never just history. I tell this to people all the time. Any history book that you read is still an interpretation for the present. That's why we constantly keep getting revisions of history. Yeah. I mean, if someone just had they just keep coming back. And that's why, like, for instance, everybody wants to reinterpret what the founding fathers were doing, because by reinterpreting what the founding fathers doing, you're changing what we are doing in the present. So that's why you have all these new books about the founding fathers, because if you can tell us what they really were thinking about these subjects, then that really tells us what we should be doing today.
Okay, well, I had this thought. So thinking about that, what you said right now, that, we read history books today, and it's an interpretation of history for us today, okay? Now, let's take that over to the Bible, My problem, or my question, is not a necessary problem, is like today, for example, and it's well known now, we talk about how people get, history school lessons, and I would say in many occasions it's very biased and sometimes not even true, because it's presented, history here in the United States to us is presented differently than to people in different countries, depending on what history it is that they want to teach, So how can we be careful, I guess, in a sense, or how can we know that the truth that the biblical stories are actually trying to tell us, instead of it, telling us something else, some other truth that isn't really what it is. You know what I mean?
Oh, so like the resurrection.
Well, anything in particular, I'm expanding this on the whole Bible. How can we separate the actual truth?
The cultural bias, you mean?
In a sense,
Maybe?
yes, like
Like you're talking about facts versus interpretation.
correct,
Like what are the true facts?
right?
Can we ever really know the true facts?
In a sense, yes,
Is that
yes,
uh, well, I think yes. I think there are ways to know the true facts, and that comes down to there is what's called the quest for historical Jesus, because there is a realization that what the Gospels don't give us is direct access to the historical Jesus. They give us a mediated access, an interpretation, which is inspired. I believe it's inspired. I believe Jesus is God. I believe that the Gospels get Jesus right. But when you come to history, the question of history and what actually happened and how we can know, there are different criteria by which we start to sift through the data. One of which is the criteria of embarrassment. Would someone make this up? So, for instance, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Okay, now Christians also believe that Jesus was righteous and sinless and never sinned. So why? And they believe that baptism, in some sense, erased our sins, or at least was a sign of repentance for sin that one had committed. So why does Jesus get baptized? Well, Matthew's gospel Jesus at that moment when he's getting baptized by John says this. John says, "I have need to be baptized by you," and Jesus says, "This is for me to fulfill all righteousness." So, but you can see in that statement a little bit of we have to explain something here.
right.
And so scholars will look at that and say, well, that looks like Jesus potentially could be, the early Christians could have been potentially embarrassed by this because it suggests that Jesus potentially was not righteous, that he had to repent of something or whatever, or had to, come in line. So they had to give that explanation. Now, so that becomes a thing that scholars would say, if Jesus, if anything was true, because of the criteria of embarrassment, the baptism of Jesus by John is something that's rock solid. So that kind of stuff, those kind of criteria, and there's a number of criteria which are like that, and which kind of give us some kind of solidifying things that says no, that's probably, like for instance, crucifixion. Would someone make up the idea that Jesus was crucified? So you want to say the Lord of the world was crucified on a cross. Well, that's an embarrassing thing to say. So it's more than likely true, and versus the opposite, not true.
Okay.
Okay.
So I find it's a very fascinating thing, and I think there's many things that we can know that are true. And I also believe that there's a guy named N.T. Wright, great guy, scholar, England, does a lot of stuff, but he's come back and he has a whole thing about even Jesus knowing that he's God, and not knowing he's God in the sense of I'm a man and my wife's a woman in that sense, but that his mission and what Jesus was doing, and it appears from what we can know from the historical data, was to live out what Yahweh was meant to do. And so that when Jesus went to the temple, it was Yahweh going to the temple because this was what God wanted to do. So Jesus was living himself as the mission, as Yahweh incarnate, doing the things that Yahweh was meant to do. So so these are things that we can possibly know. And again, you should read N.T. Wright's great stuff. But again, these are historical markers that would say what can we know from historical data. Now, there's another guy named Luke Timothy Johnson, another great scholar. He basically says, he throws up his hands and says, we can't know Jesus historically, period. So why try to reconstruct a Jesus in our own image? Let's just get to know the Gospels better as literature, because that's what they are. They're mediated. So to know the real Jesus is to know the Jesus of the Gospels, because that's the Jesus that we've been given. And that's and I like what he says too. I think he's absolutely right, that the New Testament books are what we've been given, and we shouldn't simply. So there's one thing that people do often is they make they rip apart the Gospels and they make one Gospel from the four. This was done in the early centuries. It was called the Diatessaron. They made, so I don't know if you've ever read that, like a gospel from the one gospel from the four.
Yeah.
And what you're doing in essence is saying that the unique portrait that the gospel writers have set up, the unique movie, let's just say, if we want to put it that way, is they've ripped scenes out and they've re-edited it. They took apart the inspired thing and made it some kind of messy mess. It doesn't make sense. It's not what was supposed to happen. It's not historical that way. The inspired thing is the book. The inspired thing is Mark. The inspired thing is Luke. The inspired thing is John. Not me taking this from John, this from Luke, this from Mark, and putting it in my own interpretation, my own reconstruction. And that's what Luke Timothy Johnson is going after.
Because it's the same Jesus throughout. I mean, it's the same Jesus throughout the gospel. His character temperament never changes. He just does different things. That's all he does. He's just put in different circumstances.
But the message of that particular gospel is lost by doing that.
Yeah, because you instead of getting 4 narratives, you get one, and so you miss the details. You miss the whole leaving the pot of water behind.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's like just makes no sense. It's just one of those trivial, because it's all, I guess, it becomes all trivial details. Nothing really matters in context, because again, you change the context, you change the meaning.
And it comes back to what we're talking about right now. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's the reason. It's the reason the Bible has stayed culturally relevant. Because like bringing it back to movies, for example, there's movies that transcend time. They're good no matter when you see them. You know what I mean? I mean, they're that good that you see them, and anytime I've seen movies from like the '60s that are like still amazingly good, and it's just because of the way the message is set up. And I think that actually makes the Bible very supernatural for it able to stay still culturally relevant this whole time. It says something about it, of how well this book was written, because it stays relevant no matter what. There's movies that suck so bad, you're like, it's here today, no one remembers it next year, you know what I mean? It's gone.
Yeah.
And so that's just says something about the Bible right there,
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, that's where I started Logos Made Flesh. I started Logos Made Flesh.
50 minutes later.
Yeah.
That was awesome. Full circle right now.
Yeah, is just to help people, see the that if you like I said, some people aren't able to understand movies, but they're more able to buy into that idea of what movies are, because they don't come with any baggage. They go to a movie and they're like, well, whatever, that's interesting, maybe that's cool. But when you go to the Bible and you say it's like this, and they go, no, I've never been taught that. My pastor hasn't said that. And there's people who are really ingrained into a way of seeing the Bible, and in order to try to get them out of that and to see things slightly different, maybe from that more deeper perspective, I went to something else and said, let's look at how movies work for a minute. And then when you can start going back into the Gospels and saying, well, that's just what happened in the movie. That same thing happened in this movie. And now you got to kind of, it meant something here. Does it mean something deeper here?
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to talk about the end of the Gospel of Mark, because I think Inception is exactly where.
Let's get into
Inception
a little bit of that.
And the Gospel of Mark. Here we go.
I was telling Chuck a little bit about it, and he's like, "Tell me more." I'm like, "No way, bro. You gotta wait till the episode comes out." I was driving when he
told me. I almost got in a car crash hearing that. I was like, "What? What do you mean?"
Well, pull over right now if you guys are listening. Pull over right now.
Yeah. Or if you're standing, sit down, because All right, so okay, you just said it. Mark is like Inception. Tell us why.
Yeah, and this is something. So this comes from me studying Mark, not from studying Inception. It came later from me studying Inception and going, well, that's just what Mark does. So I want to start by just prefacing it with Mark's gospel and saying Mark has been constructed like we've been talking about, and he has a narrative that flows, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those narrative details. But the end of Mark has been a question for a lot of people, and if you turn to Mark chapter 16, there is always a note in your Bibles after verse 8 that says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20. And so the earliest manuscripts that we have, some of the best manuscripts that we have, I'm sorry, not the best, but the earliest, do not contain 9 through 20. And that suggests that something is going on with the ending of Mark. In fact, there's other endings beyond verse 8 that are not 9 through 20. Some Bibles even include an alternative ending that is in some other manuscripts. So we don't just have no ending, we have a couple of endings. So the suggestion is that at some time in the past, Mark did end at 16 verse 8. And the question is, what happened? Was it supposed to end at 16 verse 8? Is it supposed to go on after that? Some people think that, like videotapes, in the first century and the time when people used scrolls, some people would not rewind the scroll after they were done reading it. And so the outside edge would have been the ending, and it's possible that it could have been damaged or broken off. So what Mark wrote accidentally was erased. Some people speculate that Mark died before he finished Mark, or that so there's a couple of explanations in that regard. Some people do believe that 16:9 through 20 is how Mark originally ended. So there's people who argue that way. But there's a growing number of scholars who believe that Mark did end originally at 8, that was his conclusion. The final verse says, after they meet the risen Jesus, the women go to the tomb, they meet the risen Jesus. They don't meet the risen Jesus. They see the angel at the tomb, and he tells them to go back to tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is risen and he'll meet them in Galilee. And it says, and they went out, this is the women, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Well, that's a very sour note. And you can tell why people don't want it to end there. No, it can't end there. This can't be the ending. Right. And so you can see you see the reason why. There's more than one ending. If someone didn't have 9 through 20, they would have wrote their own ending, because it needs a new ending. Yeah. Something's going on here. So it is a very sour note. But here's the explanation. So let me just go back. So Inception. We go back to the movie Inception. Mm-hmm. We have that same feeling at the end of Inception. Oh yeah. If you've seen the movie, Christopher Nolan made a movie. What was that?
I said that ruined my life for a while.
That movie?
That ending, I was like, what?
Yeah, so Christopher Nolan made the movie called Inception, in which they have a bunch of heist people who are stealing ideas from people. And what they do to steal ideas is they're going in people's dreams, and they go down dream levels in order to get into people's subconscious mind and to steal some kind of secret that the person has inside their mind. Now, this group of people, led by a guy named Cobb, are approached by a rich billionaire who wants to have an idea implanted in someone's mind, not stolen. And the people who are around Cobb say it's impossible, can't do it. It's never been done before. We've tried it. It doesn't work, because people realize that when an idea is being implanted in their mind, their subconscious instantly rejects it because they know it's not their own. It's easier to steal an idea than it is to implant an idea. But Cobb says, I do know a way of making it happen, because it happened in my own experience. If we go down deep enough into the layers, in terms of dream within dream within dream, the subconscious will accept it as one's own idea. And so that's how the movie proceeds. They try to implant this idea in this guy's mind. Now, the problem with that is the way the movie progresses is the dreams are so much like reality that you're never quite sure which is real and which is a dream, when you're in reality or you're in a dream. And Cobb himself seems to be totally lost in the idea that if he's in a dream or not. His wife has killed herself in the world that he is in, and he no longer can be with his kids. So he can't get back to his kids, because he's wanted for his wife's supposed murder, even though she killed herself. And he's trying to get back through this job to get back to his kids. So, but in the movie, there is what's called a totem. And by knowing this totem yourself, you can know whether you're in a dream or not. And so every time, several times in the movie, Cobb spins his totem and holds a gun in his hand because he wants to know if he's in a dream or reality. Again, in reality, his wife, or in the reality that he thinks is real, we're not quite sure if it's a dream or not, his wife has died and he can't be with his kids. So if he kills himself, he goes back to reality. If you die in a dream, you wake up. So he wants to wake up if it is indeed a dream. So he uses this totem to find out if he's truly in reality. So he spins the totem. It's a little top, and he holds a gun, hoping perhaps that the totem will show that he's in a dream, so he can wake up. But again, we're not quite sure. He does that several times throughout the movie, and when he gets to the final part of the movie, he spins the top. When he finally makes it back, he puts this idea in this guy's mind, and he's able to get back to the United States to go see his kids, and his kids are outside, and he spins the top, and he walks away from the top, and the top keeps spinning, and the camera's on the top, and we're watching the top, whether it's going to fall or not, because we want to know if this is a dream or reality. And the movie cuts out before we can know.
He just made me feel those feelings again.
And you're like, no!
Spoiler alert.
I want to know if it's dream or reality. So the ending itself becomes ambiguous.
Yeah.
Christopher Nolan does not want to tell us if it's in a dream, if we're in a dream or not. He leaves it completely ambiguous. And people were frustrated. So you go on the internet, and people are all debating whether he was in a dream or reality. Yeah. It's fantastic. It's awesome. I mean, it's just like, was he wearing a ring at this time? I mean, it could be a dream. It could not be a dream.
Yeah, that frame by frame breakdowns. I've seen those YouTube videos of frame by frame breakdowns. You're like, whoa, these people are like, got nothing else better to do?
Right. And it's and I love the way that Christopher Nolan plays with our head like that. I mean, it's fantastic. Yeah. But here's what people miss is that it's the point of the movie is not in what's in the foreground, it's what's in the background. So when he spins the top, we're all focused on that top, but in the background, what Cobb is doing is walking away from the top for the first time to go to embrace his kids
without a gun in his hand. And throughout the movie, 3 times in fact, we hear people say, Maul says his employer says, you got to take a leap of faith. You got to take a leap of faith. And then Cobb in one point says, you got to take a leap of faith. So at the very end, he takes a leap of faith to walk away from that question. He can know. There's no way he can know. So instead of not, focusing on what he doesn't know, he walks away from the top to embrace his kids, because that's the most important thing in this moment. So Cobb has now taken a leap of faith to live in that moment rather than going, I don't know or not. It doesn't matter. What matters most now is to embrace the moment, embrace his kids. Mm-hmm. So the explanation to the film, the heart of the film, is in the action that Cobb takes towards that dreidel, that top, where he walks away to embrace his kids. And that's what Mark is doing. When we get to the end and we go, no, that can't be the end. Well, it's actually a really great ending. What Mark has done by ending it there is wants you to look at what he's actually told you. So it's not in the cutout, what is it going to fall or not? Is the top going to fall or not? It's what Christopher Nolan has already told us is the point of the film. So we want to see at the end of Mark 16 verse 8, we want to see the risen Jesus. And we're hoping to see the risen Jesus. Matthew has it, Mark has it, Matthew, Luke, and John all have it, but Mark doesn't if it ends at verse 16 verse 8. And so we go, no, that can't be the way that it ends. The women go out and say nothing to anyone. I can't believe that. Well, then you ask yourself, why would Mark end there? Just like we asked the idea of the top spinning, with Christopher Nolan's film. Why would it end there? And there's a few details that Mark gives at the ending, and they become more important if you
if you don't look at 9 through 20. Because Mark does tell us things up to that point, and they seem to just be trivial details. Happenstance, like, okay, we know that. But they take on an added significance if we're not looking for something more. I mean, to come afterwards. Instead, we're looking at it, what does Mark tell us about the end? Well, one thing he does tell us, a few things. He tells us that there was a young man at the tomb who when the women show up, verse 5, 16 verse 5, and entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, and he tells them this message: do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He was risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, what's interesting is that this isn't the way that it goes down in the other Gospels. So we have a promise for Jesus. They said, go back to Galilee, and that's where Jesus is going to meet you. But in Luke's Gospel, where does Jesus meet his disciples?
The upper room?
Yeah, he meets them in Jerusalem.
Oh, yeah, they're all in Jerusalem.
And in John, it's in Jerusalem, and Matthew kind of goes along with Mark and says that they go up to a high mountain. But the idea is that we have a discrepancy here in terms of where they first meet Jesus. So the message that Mark gives right away is that the angel says, go back to Galilee. That's where he's going to meet you. And in Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel, there is no going back to Galilee. They meet him in Jerusalem. So a slight discrepancy there. So what's going on with that? So we have this young man. Why is he not called an angel? I mean, in the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, the person's an angel, always called an angel. But here in Mark's Gospel, not called an angel, called a young man. Another thing I think is important, and I don't think we quite realize, is that the stone that's rolled away from the tomb takes on a great significance. It says that when Jesus was finally killed, crucified, when he dies, in verse 15, chapter 15, verse 46, and it says, and he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. And then in chapter 16, the women are on the way to anoint Jesus' body with some spices. And it says, they asked, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. It was very large. So because we have the Easter story so much in our culture, just say the stone was rolled away, as if that is somehow significant, in the sense that it means Jesus rose from the dead. It means nothing. Stone absolutely doesn't have to roll away. Does Jesus walk through walls? Absolutely he does. Did the stone have to roll away?
No.
Dude.
No. But Mark emphasizes the rolling of the stone 3 times. He tells us that it was a stone roll against it. They want to know who's going to roll the stone, and they find the stone rolled away, and it's large. Is there something there? I think there is, and I didn't come to it just because I saw this, but it's in the Gospel of Mark. So those details, when we stop looking at the foreground, stop saying, why don't they show Jesus? And we start looking at the background, start saying, what details does he show us? We start seeing the meaning of Mark's Gospel all getting tied up. In those details, Mark ties up his entire narrative. And they look just like they're trivial details, but they're not. They're deeply significant. So one of the things is, when Jesus tells him to go, or the young man tells him to go back to Galilee, and there you will meet me there. Well, there's the Gospel of Mark is structured like this. It starts off in Galilee, chapters 1 through 8, thereabouts. And then between 8 and 10, Jesus journeys to Jerusalem. And then 11 through 16, Jesus is in Jerusalem. So it's basically 2 geographic locations with a journey in between. That's how Mark is structured geographically, his narrative. John's Gospel, for instance, doesn't do it that way. If you read the story of John's story, Jesus is in Jerusalem several times. He's in Galilee, he's in Jerusalem, he's in Galilee, he's in Jerusalem, he's in Galilee. If you just read Mark's gospel, you would have the impression that Jesus never started his ministry, did it in Galilee, and then only went one time to Jerusalem, and that's where he was crucified. But John's gospel has the idea that Jesus was going back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem. So it is a narrative way of looking at it. He structured it this way. Perhaps Jesus went, obviously we know that Jesus went more than one time to Jerusalem. But Mark gives us the focus, and these two geographic locations take on a characteristic, a character trait. In Galilee is where Jesus calls his disciples. And how does he call his disciples? Remember the message?
He's going to make them fishers of men.
Yeah, he says, but before that, they're at their father's nets, they're fishing, and what is Jesus? The first thing he says? Come follow me.
Oh, yeah. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Right.
That's right. So, and they drop everything and they leave and go follow Jesus. Then he says it to James and John, and they drop everything and follow Jesus. This idea of following Jesus is central to the Gospel of Mark. So, dropping everything, leaving everything, following after Jesus. So again, we have Galilee. That's the theme for Mark. Galilee, Jerusalem, with that journey in between. Remember, it's a journey, it's a way. In fact, if you just look at Mark chapter 1, verse 1, verse 2, it says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So we have the way, and the paths. So we have the idea of a road. This Mark's gospel is a story of a road. It's a story of a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And now if you turn to chapter 8, verse, sorry about this. I'm using a different Bible than I used before. Here we go. Chapter 8, verse 34. It says, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone who would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? So the idea is that they're following Jesus in his journey. Where's Jesus going to? He's going to Jerusalem. Why is he going to Jerusalem? He's going to die on the cross. And what are the disciples called to do exactly the same? Follow him by picking up the cross and going exactly to where he goes, which is his death. Mm-hmm. So when Jesus says, follow me, it means to do what I do, go where I go. And that means if I carry a cross, you're carrying a cross too, and we're both going to our deaths. That's the call. And Mark reiterates it several times. I don't have time to go into that. But the idea is it's a journey. Now, and that's what they've been called to. Now, if you go to the end of Mark, again, Mark chapter 16, the story, the young man then takes on a great significance. The message is, hey, go back to Galilee, and that's where Jesus is going to meet you, right? Go back to Galilee, and that's where Jesus is going to meet you. Not in Jerusalem, but go back to Galilee. Well, the young man says here, verse 5, chapter 16, says, entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Okay, so it's not an angel. It's a young man, and this is significant because a young man only appears one other time in the Gospel of Mark. He appears in Mark chapter 14.
Sorry, I got ahead of myself.
You found it already?
No, go ahead, continue. I was thinking out loud.
Oh, man, I'm going to have a hard time finding it because it's not... no, that's not it.
Chapter 14.
Is it 14?
No, it was that was the Bible app was saying it was chapter 14. He doesn't know anything though. No, I think it was at the garden, right? The kid where
it is.
Yeah, the garden with the kid where they take away his robe. That's right. With the guards take away, he's like the young man.
That's right. So right here it says verse 51 of chapter 14, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, we don't know the identity of this person. It doesn't really matter because Mark isn't telling us the story because he wants us to know the identity. He tells us the story because the young man becomes a symbol for the disciples. Okay? So he tells us everything that happens to the disciples. They all run away. And then he says, and there was a young man who was wearing nothing but a linen sheet around his naked body, and they pulled free from him and ran away naked. That linen sheet only appears one other time in the Gospel of Mark as well, and it's wrapped around the dead body of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. So the idea that what the disciples are running away from is the mantle that they've been clothed in. They've left everything to follow Jesus. And Jesus has clothed them in the one thing which he himself has been clothed in, which is the call to go and die. And at this moment, when the place comes, that Jesus tells them in Mark chapter 8 through 10, there's no question about it. Jesus has told them, come and die with me. Come and die with me. And they say, we'll follow you, Lord. We'll go with you wherever you go. And he says, my road is to my death.
Never mind then.
Mark chapter, let me just look at one more point. Mark chapter 10, when Jesus when James and John come to him and say, Lord, do whatever we want. We're going to ask you something. He goes, okay, what do you want? Grant, verse 37 of chapter 10, grant us to sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory. And Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, only 2 people are ever on Jesus' right and in his left. You guys know who that is?
Nope. John and Peter?
The thieves on the cross.
Ooh.
Mark, in fact, tells us after a series of details, because they call it, hey, we want to sit on your right and your left in your glory. And Jesus says, well, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Which is his death. See, they don't understand what they're asking. What is Jesus' glory? What was that?
He was talking about his crucifixion, not...
That's right.
Not in heaven glory. Like, that's actually where I am going to be glorified.
Well, but here's the thing is, this is where it gets very ironic. Where is Jesus' glory in Mark? It is the cross. The cross is Christ's coronation. It is an ironic coronation. So he receives everything that a king receives in the moment that he's crucified. So, but that's the thing is that in Mark's gospel, the world has been turned upside down in Christ's crucifixion. The Lord of all the world has been crucified, but it's in this crucifixion that he's receiving his glory. And that's where, and he tells them that in between chapter 8 and chapter 10, I don't want to go on this too far because there's so much we could get, but between chapter 8, 3 times Jesus tells them, I'm going up to Jerusalem to die. I'm going to Jerusalem to die. I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to be, whipped on, spit on, beat on. And then the disciples they start thinking in ways that are contradictory to that. For instance, Peter the first time says, never, Lord, will that happen to you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And that's where he gives them a paradox. To save your life is to lose it. Then the next time Jesus does it, the disciples they start arguing with one another about who's the greatest. And Jesus is like, to be the greatest is to be the slave. And then in this case, Jesus does the exact same thing. And then James and John, immediately after Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, they go, hey, can we sit on your right and your left in your glory? And Jesus again gives them a paradox in the preceding verse. Again, to save your life is to lose it. To become the leader is to become the slave. To become the first is to become the last. So this idea of upside down, what is upside down has now become right side up. And so when Jesus is crucified, that is his glory. That's his coronation. If you've seen those pictures of the queen being, or the king, monarchs of Europe, in their moment of coronation, where they hold a globe in their hand with that cross on it, and they have a scepter, and they've got all of the stuff there, and you go, that's a coronation. That's the moment they became king or queen. Well, when we see the crucifixion, in Mark, and basically that's the idea, the same idea. This is Christ's coronation. It's his glory, and it's what we've been called to do and be like him. And the disciples are said, come with me, come with me, come with me. And they keep, and he knows they're not going to. In this passage, he knows that they're not going to, but it's what they've been called to do. And so in the moment when the disciples run away, we have this young man clothed only in this linen sheet who runs away naked. What's nakedness in the Bible? It's a symbol of shame. He leaves, even what he had, he left behind. And that was the death and burial thing there. So when we find in chapter 16 the young man, are you guys there still?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, we're just
you guys.
we're just like deep in thought.
Yeah, we're thinking about all kinds of things. Yeah.
Keep going, Matt Miller.
So the young man here at the very end, who rolled away the stone for the entrance of the tomb, and looking up, they saw the stone had been. I'm sorry. So the young man here, now he is sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. And when I say that there's only two people who ever sit on Jesus' right and left, it actually is mirrored in the way that it's said in chapter 10. Here we find the young man seated on the right side, not of Jesus, but of the tomb, and says dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. So now the reason I also know that it's mirrored with that other passage is that in the last passage it said the young man was clothed only in a linen sheet. Now we find him clothed in white, which is in the Bible what the saints wear, what the people who are restored wear.
Yeah, redemption, right?
It's the redemption, and that's why the message is telling them the redemption that has happened. Go tell the disciples and Peter. Why Peter? Well, Peter's the one who betrayed him specifically, but all the disciples did. Go before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there's a message of hope and restoration, of redemption. They've really blown it. And I think we've got to go back into Mark and see how badly they blew it. Because we always go, well, Jesus knew they were going to fall. Yes, but if you look at the message over and over again, and the message to us is that this is going to cost you something. If you follow me, it's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you your life. And at the moment where they had to step over into what Jesus was doing, they said, I'm done, I'm out. And they left him to experience it all. And so when he's raised from the dead, he comes to them and says, hey, here's the restoration. I'm calling you again to follow me. And where does the following happen? Go back to Galilee. Start over again. The journey's the same. And follow me to Jerusalem.
Dude. But this time do it with the Holy Spirit, with my help, inside of you.
With that wine, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man.
But the destination, he doesn't say, okay, the destination is still the same. It's still your death. And we know the disciples, that was their death. He says, you will drink the cup that I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized.
Yeah,
but at this particular moment, not going to happen yet.
Second time around, they all did it.
That's right. That's right. So, that's this is a story. So if you look at Mark's gospel, and I said earlier that Mark's was written to people who already knew the story. Mark isn't evangelizing the lost in this story. He's evangelizing the found, who are now shaking in their knees. I mean, they're quaking, and perhaps some of them have actually denied. He's telling the story of Peter. He's telling the story of betrayal. He's telling the story, and they're going, because they're coming back. And the Sunday after, there was a persecution, and a lot of them tuck tail and run. Maybe some of them hasn't even shown up yet.
Yeah. And
it's the message of hope to a church that's abandoned their call to follow and die with Jesus. And so it is specifically told with that, what's called Sitz and Laban, that life setting, that place where everyone is at. This story is being told. He's going back to the story to tell them something that they need to know. And the story is that your destination is not the same, but you can start over again. Jesus is still calling, and he's calling you to follow. The calling is not, he's not turned his back on you. You've turned his back on him, and he's still calling you. Come and follow. Come and die with me. So that's very important. The last thing I want to look at is the rock, the stone that's rolled. I mean, what significance is that? Well, stone only appears um, twice in the Gospel of Mark, the word stone, before this incident, and it occurs in the section where Mark. There's 5 different sections in Mark's Gospel, and Mark divides those in a parallel structure. He does it in a way that we're not quite used to, but it's not by your chapter divisions. Our chapter divisions were just arbitrarily thrown in there, and the verses throw them out. But if you listen and you hear the repetition in words and the repetition in ideas, there is a structure or a pattern that you're supposed to pick up on. Just like the story of the Goldilocks and the 3 bears. I mean, we know that repetition is saying, that this is the first incident, this is the second incident, this is the third instance. You see that there's a pattern, the way storytellers tell a story. One of those ways is in a paralleling. So it's called an inclusio. If you start a story and you end it exactly the same way. For instance, Castaway. Castaway begins with the crossroads, and it ends with the same crossroads. So you know from the beginning to the end that there's that it's a totality. It feels like it's complete, like bookends. And the Bible does that many different times. In Mark's Gospel, there's many different inclusios that group sections together. One of these sections is where Jesus enters Jerusalem and confronts the Temple Mount and the temple leadership. And it begins in chapter 11 when Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, and he goes to the temple, and he, on his way to the temple, he in fact sees a fig tree. Remember that story?
Yeah.
Sees a fig tree and sees that there's no figs on it and curses the fig tree. Then he goes into Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, and the very next day, they see that the fig tree has been withered from the root. And Peter says, "Man, how can you do this?" And he says, "If you ask anything, it will be given to you in prayer. You can say to this mountain, 'Be thou removed,' and it will be taken up and thrown into the sea." You know what I'm saying? What mountain is he referring to at that moment? He's looking at the Temple Mount. The fig tree, be the way that it's sandwiched, the temple cleansing is sandwiched between these 2 stories. The fig tree becomes the representative of what's taking place in the Temple Mount. The fig tree is the Temple Mount. Jesus has cursed the fig tree, and it is withered. And Jesus is now looking at the mountain in the context of Mark, and saying, "If you can say to this mountain, 'Be thou removed,' and it'll be plucked up and thrown in the sea." So Jesus is actively going against the Temple Mount and the temple establishment. That's why we get in everybody reads chapter 13 or Matthew 24. It's called the mini apocalypse. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
The idea. This is the destruction
24,
of the temple and set. What was that?
No, it said Matthew 24. It's the big one of the big ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jesus curses the temple. And talks about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Right.
Anyway, my point being is that there's a inclusio, part of what we might call it's more of a inclusio. At the end of in chapter 12, verse 10, Jesus says, "Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become this cornerstone. This is what the Lord's doing, and is marvelous in our eyes." And he's just told the parable of the tenants. God, plants a vineyard and rents it out to some people, and then he wants his fruit, and he sends people to get his fruit, just like the fig tree. Doesn't get it because he gets the people he keeps sending get beaten up, killed, and so forth. So God finally says, "I'm going to send my son. They'll respect my son." They don't respect the son. They kill the son, and it says, "What will the owner of the vineyard do?" Well, he's going to come and kill those people and give the vineyard to someone else. And so that has everything to do with the temple leadership, the temple establishment, and what God's going to do. And that's where he quotes this passage: "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is what the Lord's doing, and is marvelous in our eyes." Jesus is the cornerstone that has been rejected and is now going to be made the chief stone. On the other end of the only other time we see stone happens at the beginning of 13, where the disciples are walking along and they see the Temple Mount. And they say, "Look, Master, what lovely stones.
Right.
Verse 13, verse 1. And as they came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to them, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be one left here, one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So there's a parallel idea that Jesus is the rejected stone who becomes the chief cornerstone, and the stone, which is the temple, the stone which was in that position, is now going to be cast down. Again, that idea of flipping, of reversal. Jesus is now the temple, which we gather around. The Temple Mount is now the one that has been brought down and destroyed. So when the stone rolls away, and there's a reason for that. Let me point one more passage. Mark, am I going too long, guys? I don't want to.
No. Continue.
I'm almost
please.
done.
No, continue.
Okay, Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Jesus is before the council, the Sanhedrin. Okay, it says in verse 58, they bring false witnesses to accuse Jesus. They're false witnesses, but what they say is eerily similar to what Jesus has said and what we also find him saying in the Gospel of John. Verse 58, we heard him say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. And the high priest, listen to this. So the temple made with hands, temple made without human hands. So what might they heard Jesus saying? Well, he might have been talking about his body, right?
Right.
I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, my body, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. So the temple there and Jesus are correlated. And this goes on in the latter part of Mark's gospel, is that what happens to the temple in 70 AD is what happens to Jesus in 30 AD. So everything that Jesus undergoes, he undergoes the destruction of the temple that is going to happen in 70 AD. There's the idea of real tight connection between the temple and Jesus. So Jesus is undergoing the temple's destruction. So when Jesus dies on the cross, remember in Mark's gospel, when he breathes his last, what happens to the temple? The curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. There's this tight similarity, this tight structural connection between them. And here, when Jesus says, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." This is very important because later on, let me just go here and show you the context. This has an Old Testament reference. Made with hands and made without hands. It has a strong link to a passage in the Old Testament, one passage in particular in the Old Testament. And we find its context here. When they asked him, again, the high priest asked him, verse 61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garment and said, "What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy." So they asked him, "Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." That's a specific reference to an Old Testament passage. You guys know what passage that is?
I know the context with which you're speaking it, but I don't know exactly where it's from.
Because it does happen a few times.
It's Daniel chapter 7. The reason Jesus, now in Ezekiel calls himself Son of Man all the time, and Son of Man has a specific saying. But we find that the reason Jesus calls himself the Son of Man is in reference to Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, it is a prophecy of 4 beasts. Okay.
Right.
And I'm not going to, one looks like a lion and has, eagle's wings. I'm not going to get into all the beasts.
Right.
But the 4th one is more terrifying than the others until the Ancient of Days comes, which is God the Father, comes and opens the books. And it says, Daniel says, then I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And he's coming to the Ancient of Days to receive a kingdom which will not be destroyed, because the Son of Man has now destroyed these other 4 kingdoms. Each of these beasts represent 4 kingdoms, and the Son of Man represents the 5th. Now, in terms of conceptual ideas, again, the idea that this is a Son of Man, which is just another word for man, compared to beasts. These are animals. So 4 animals, which represent 4 kingdoms, and now the Son of Man this image of God now comes and reverses that, sets up his own kingdom, one which will never be destroyed, it says. Now that passage, Daniel 7, is itself parallel with another passage because of the way that Daniel is structured. It's parallel with Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 tells of a very similar prophecy, but it uses different imagery. And that image is of a statue. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a statue. It has a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of, anyway, it goes on down to, more from precious metals to more, sturdy, strong metals that are, in the end. But it's 4 different kingdoms. And that is now get the image here. It is a statue, which is in essence an idol. When we hear this type of imagery in Old Testament terms, this is an abomination. This is an idol standing as a representative of a god, let's just say. Right. And on the hillside, it says in Daniel chapter 2, let me turn there real quick because I think this is really important. Daniel chapter 2, it says, as you looked at, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we tell the king the interpretation. So he tells the interpretation about the kingdoms being 4 different kingdoms, but go down to verse 44 of chapter 2, and it says, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, this is about the rock, that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. So when we have this idea of stones, again, the idea that Jesus is the stone, which the builders have rejected, which has become the chief cornerstone, and not one of these stones shall be left upon another, but be cast down. The connection with stones and the temple is sure. And again, this idea of the coming of the Son of Man, the idea of stone made without hands, without human hands, all that kind of stuff. When we get to Mark chapter 16, at the very end, what do we find? And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in the tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Again, that idea of being cut out of the rock, too. Right. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. By what? Without human hands. It doesn't say that, but the implication is pretty clear. It was very large. Somebody rolled the stone. It wasn't by human hands. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. The idea is that right here, we have the first... The thing that should get you excited, just like in that top, whether the top tumbles or falls or not, it doesn't matter. In this instance, do we see Jesus or not see Jesus? It doesn't matter. We need to follow Jesus. Why? Because that stone is rolled. The first step to the establishment of the kingdom of God has now taken place. It is happening right now. The kingdom has been established. It is being established, and it will never be destroyed. That should get people excited. It doesn't leave on a sour note. The sour note is where people go, they run away and they're afraid. Why are you afraid? when the stone has been rolled away without human hands? There's no reason to be afraid. So it's a message of redemption. It's a message of hope. It's a little bit of a judgment on the people who run away afraid. Don't be afraid. But more than that, it's a message of triumph and victory, of the kingdom of God being established in this world. The last thing, one of the things is interesting, is that in Mark's gospel, he says, "I will not drink this cup until the kingdom of God has been established." You guys know that when he's in the upper room.
Right.
And at one point during the crucifixion, they try to give him some sour wine, and he refuses it. But then right before, at the crucifixion, right before he breathes his last, he drinks the wine. Because the kingdom of God has been established in that moment, not in the resurrection, in his enthronement. That's the place where the kingdom of God was established. And that's the place we need to go back to. Go back to the cross. Go back to the journey to Jerusalem. Anyway, that's the idea. So reading Mark, and I think this is very much in keeping cinematically. This is not, it's structurally important for the circumstances and the situation that these people are in. He's telling them a story that they already know. You know this story. In fact, they probably heard way more stuff than we even know, because all we have is Mark. But they heard lots of stories about Jesus. They had lots of people telling them stories about Jesus. And Mark has condensed all those stories and told them this story for a very specific purpose. And he wants to remind them of the power of God and for their redemption, and also to remind them that they've really screwed up and they need to seek Jesus again.
Man, you just proven that I don't know anything about the Bible.
Dude, you took the words out of my mind.
Like, I know more about the Illuminati and Rosicrucians and the reptilians that live in Hollow Earth than I do about the Bible. Golly.
Oh gosh.
No, I laugh so I won't cry, Matt. Seriously, like, this is like the reason we were quiet. But if you would have been in the same room with us, me and Chuck were just like back and forth, just looking at each other like, whoa. Dude, this makes so much sense, because believe it or not, what you just said right now ties perfectly with what Joshua Wisely in our last episode.
Right on.
Oh my gosh, that's
right. Because we were talking about this. No, you didn't even know.
You haven't even heard that.
No, I haven't.
It's called the Holy Spirit, because it hasn't come out yet. We're gonna bring it out today. Well, by the time you guys are listening, it'll be 2 weeks. But still, it ties perfectly in what we're saying. This whole thing about signs and symbolisms. But going back to my first comment, yeah, man, like I need to delve more deep and start reading the Bible within this context. And you know what? And I was thinking a lot of things, but I didn't want to interrupt you, man, because you were just like on this roll, which was just phenomenal. But it makes so much sense for the people that are sitting and watching this film, listening to this story in the second century, where they're just being they're being persecuted. They're reading it. I mean, they're listening to it somewhere between 30 and 70 AD, and they're being persecuted. Right? They're going through trouble. Yeah. Rome is on their back. The temple hasn't been destroyed. People are taking away their land. The family is against them because now they're Christian. They're not Jews or pagans. Right? They're trying to follow the way, and then they're there on a Sunday, listening to somebody tell them, hey, you see these disciples, guys? Yeah, they ran away, but then they had another opportunity. And you know the stories. You guys know. Mm-hmm. You know the stories that they went back, and some of them are dying, and some of them are captured. But guess what? The redemption is here. Jesus established the kingdom. He was coronated on the cross. Man, I would be in the audience. I'd be bawling. I'd be like, oh, man, there's hope. Yeah. Let's do this. If I have to die, I have to die. Man, it's just like context. It's just like blowing my mind right now. I'm done.
One more thing, which you were just talking about, I think is really important, is Mark is a story, obviously, and it's told on a Sunday morning or whatever it was, just like we would go to see a movie or go to church and hear a story given, watch a story given in terms of the screen. But that happens in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 4, this is another thing we just pass over. Mark tells us a story about Jesus telling stories. And in the parables, Mark chapter 4, Jesus tells a parable. He stands up and is delivering in his story a story. And if you guys have saw my thing on the sixth sense, that's what we call metacinematic. When somebody references a story, in a story, oftentimes that story is referential to the larger story.
Yeah,
So
it is.
when Mark tells us the first parable, and Jesus says this is the key to all the parables, he gives the parable of the sower. And it says a sower went out to sow seed, and he threw seed along the path, and he threw seed along the stony ground, and he threw seed along the weeds, and he threw seed some that fell along the good soil, and some got choked out, some was picked up by the birds, some got choked out this way, but some produced fruit. And Jesus says, and they said, hey, explain the parable to us. And Jesus said, if you don't understand this parable, how will you understand all the parables? And then Jesus explains it. But here's the interesting thing is, the seed is the parable. It goes out locked. The seed has to find the right soil in order to be unlocked. And so when the seed is cast out, it's cast out into the people that are there. And some people receive it gladly. Some people don't quite get it. Some people it doesn't really take root. And yet some grab onto it and continue to follow through with it. So the parable of the sower is the parable of the parables, but it's also the story. The parables themselves are what unlocks the Gospel of Mark. Mark is telling you how to interpret his gospel. That this isn't just something that happened. This is something that happens. This is meaningful in a much deeper way. So don't just, read it once and walk away. Don't just read it twice and think about it just a little bit more. Keep going. Keep unlocking. Keep going deep. Keep digging into it. Because he's saying there's more here than just a parable, than just a story about seed. There's more here than just, this is what's going to transform the world. And that's what Mark's gospel is. He's saying, Mark is throwing out seed. He's throwing out the gospel of Mark, saying, if you have ears to hear what this story is about. Because this story has the power to change you. It has the power to give you insight and to illuminate you so you can continue on in your journey. And that's what I think is when we talk about Christopher Nolan being metacinematic, which I did in my video. Mark is absolutely metacinematic. He knows what he's doing. He's telling you what Jesus is telling you so you can know how to understand Mark's gospel better. So,
yeah, man, it's good stuff. Good stuff. Very, very good stuff. Well, I think
sure you don't want to move out to Southern California.
you got two BFFs here waiting for you, man.
Yeah,
we'll go watch Blade Runner with you. Don't you worry about that.
It'd be a lot of fun. Hey, and you know what? Portland's calling, man. It's nice up here. It's starting to rain for 9 months. You guys might like it.
Oh, that sounds crazy.
Yeah,
it's
nice.
Like 3 days of
nice
rain
and green though.
Complaining.
It'll be a good time to start wearing my Uggs now.
Your Uggs? You don't have Uggs. Dude, get out of here, dude.
Because you haven't bought anything.
Yeah, I'm not gonna buy you Uggs.
I'll
That's
sport
embarrassing.
them. What do you know about that? What about now style? Okay, so you know what? We don't want to take more of your time, Matt. Because we've had you on for quite a while, and we know you're a busy guy, large family living out there. So we want to thank you. We want to thank you so much for coming on the show, for dropping this immense knowledge on us, because it's knowledge, it's wisdom, it's making. I'm gonna go back and listen to this show again, probably 3 times or 4 times, because there's so many things that I'm sure I'm gonna keep picking up, just because you help us understand. I'm sure the listeners also. You helped me understand personally how to read the Bible. How to read certain books, the narrative, the story, the context, and that's what I'm trying to, and that's what we're learning more and more. I don't know if you noticed that, Chuck. I think that we're being pushed towards like, hey, this is how you should read this book. This is how you should starting to understand, because it's deep. It's deep, you know. So I don't know, man. I'm.
You done?
I'm done, dude. Like my mind is like.
He can't even put
talk.
words together right now. So, all right, Matt. Can you tell us where to find you again? You know, for those people that didn't listen to the first episode, where are you at, and what's going on with your YouTube channel and all that good stuff?
Yeah. You can. I switched out. I'm no longer Matthew Scott Miller on YouTube. I'm now just Logos Made Flesh. logosmadeflesh. That's the channel title, and it's also my email address, logosmadeflesh@gmail.com. You can also find it at logosmadeflesh.com, which is my website, where you can find those 25 interesting things about me that Omar brought. So I'm not a great writer.
I'm gonna need a picture of that
that high school
thing. You can email at sfradio@gmail.com.
That is on Facebook somewhere. So
that'll be the episode.
Wearing a crown. So
that'll be the episode graphics. Is your picture of your beauty. Just kidding, man. Just kidding.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. I do. And listen, guys. Thank you so much. I'm deeply humbled that you would ask me, invite me onto your show. I've enjoyed it immensely. I don't get many opportunities to teach. I used to teach, but I don't anymore. And I'd love to have more opportunities. And I appreciate what you guys have done for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Not a problem at all. I mean, really, the pleasure, the honor is all ours. I mean, I enjoyed the work that you had, and just it's even more. I enjoy it even more that you have such a great knowledge of the Bible, because that's really what interests us, because the show itself, and I'm sure some of the people that listen to our show are kind of like, hey, this isn't the fire theft that started, because we really had in mind to really kind of expose more of the conspiracy side of stuff, but tie it back to the Bible with a biblical perspective, and we still do for those people that are like, oh, wait a minute, are you saying you're not going to do that anymore? And, we got plans to do quite a few interesting episodes, but...
Relax, people. We'll get to Sasquatch soon enough.
Yeah, we'll get to the Sasquatch stuff and things like that, but what me and Omar have always talked about, off the air, and we always talk about, is what really helped us grow and understand and bring peace to our minds and hearts, but really just help us get over a lot of the things that we experienced in life. Isn't all that weird stuff, even though it's interesting and it's great to know, yes, but it's the understanding of who God really is and what he's left for us. When we started understanding that, really that's the most important thing, that understanding what God has left us, the Word of God as he left it, understanding grace, all those things that me and Omar had trouble understanding because we came from a cult, we didn't know what that was, and I'm sure there's tons of people out there that might not have been in a high-level cult like us, but there's a lot of misnomers, a lot of misunderstanding of what the Bible actually says, and this is why we have all these denominations. We have all these things that people say, oh, God says this, God says that, and God never said that, because they interpret things the wrong way in the Bible, and we have all these misunderstandings of what Christianity is supposed to look like biblically, and these kind of things really brings you back to understand, like, oh my gosh, we have it wrong. The Bible doesn't have it wrong. God is really real, and he's working through this amazing book called the Bible, and it resonates a lot more when you understand the signs, the symbols, and what it's really trying to telegraph you in the story, So all this stuff is extremely important for everybody's understanding of who God is, and this is why I truly appreciate this kind of information,
Good. Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, hey, Matt, stick around. We're going to close this segment out.
Yes, stick around, Matt. Everybody else, listen to some awesome music that I just found. You're going to really like this, I think. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but I think you will. Anyway, stick around, and we'll be right back. Woo! What did I say? Oh my gosh, my brain. So much there is to know if you pay attention to the details. Moral of the story, if anything you got out of this episode, understand this. Read the Bible like a cinematic story. Understand there's something being telegraphed. There's a lot of details in there for a very specific reason. Each writer is trying to tell you something. Get rid of your cultural biases. Get rid of everything you think you know and start understanding the Word of God through the eyes of the person who wrote it. Okay? And you'll start just getting more and more and more out of it. Hey guys, so like I said, that was Matt Miller. Amazing material that he has. If you didn't catch it in the beginning of the show, check him out on logosmadeflesh. So check him out over there. He's got a lot of amazing things that I think you guys will really enjoy, especially when it comes to movies. He's got a lot of cool stuff when it comes to movies, things that I've never even thought of. Check it out. The other announcement I have is I finally recorded my episode with Basil Rosewater, and it was a good one. We had a pretty good conversation, and you guys, I think, are really going to enjoy it. If you want to know a little bit more about Chuck and his shenanigans when he was doing occult practices and, all my life before Jesus, and then getting to find out about Jesus through the old church I was going to, and finding out that I was actually in a cult and all that good stuff. Ugh, yeah, rough business. But hey, I also talk about how I found joy again and how I started finding out what God is really like according to the Bible. And again, that's the only way I found that out is because I started to understand the Bible in its actual context, not in the context presented to me from your modern day context. Like we said, we have these biases. Like I said earlier, we tend to read it like it was written for us, but it was written. It was written for us, but not to us, as we like to say on the show. So hey. That's another thing. Did I forget? Oh, yeah, Omar. Omar wrote it down here. Do not forget to tell him. So, hey, now it is so easy to rate the show. If you listen to us on iTunes, okay, subscribe on iTunes if you are able to. And if you do, it is so easy to rate the show now. Now, as soon as you subscribe, right beneath the episodes, when you start listening to the episode, you'll see it right there. You can click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars and give us a rating, man. Help us out. Every time we boost the show, me and Omar, that comes out of our pocket. As you well know, we don't ask for donations. We try and run the show just us, me, and Omar. So it'll truly help us out get that episode. I'll get the show on the top of the charts so you can get promoted easier. More people can start listening to the content, and it's super easy to do. Like I said, you just click on the show. Right beneath it, you click on the stars, and it's there. It's done. So you can catch us at firetheftradio.com. You can email us at firetheftradio@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram at firetheftradio, and on Twitter at Chuck and Omar, firetheftradio. So, hey, check us out, man. We got a lot of stuff that we are working on. We are going to do some pretty interesting episodes coming up pretty soon. So please do stick around, and do not forget to spread the fire. Later, guys.